speaker is the Stefano Moia from Maastricht University and the chair-elect of the Open Science Special Interest Group of the Organization of Human Brain Mapping. The title of his talk is The Gain and the Hurdles of Making Science a Community Effort, the case of Physiopy. So Stefano, I will hand over to you.
Thank you very much. And thank you for having me here this morning or day, whatever it is in your case. I'm going to talk about a little scientific project that I did with a lot of fantastic people in the last 4 years that also I learned this summer, taught me a skill that I wanted to learn since I was 8. But let me explain. So first of all, I have a couple of disclaimers. I am a member of the Physiopy community, which is what I'm presenting in this moment. And I have a bias toward the core tenets of open science as better scientific practices. That will become clear during this presentation. Might not be the case for everybody. I'm also fairly based by my own experience, and this is a presentation about it. And what I'm saying might not hold for everybody, but I hope it might be found interesting by somebody and inspire somebody else. So first of all, what is Physiopy and why Physiopy? First of all, we were born in 2019 to spark the interest of more researchers in a topic that we thought was a very still niche topic, that was the integration of physiological measures in neuroimaging, especially with MRI. And we wanted to promote this topic, see more data collected and shared. And so what we thought about was, let's give people data, let's give people toolboxes and documentation to know how to do, to treat this data. And especially, let's share everything. Let's work toward the concept of open science. And that was our core tenet since the beginning. And we did so starting as a community. So we started community practices meetings. We started discussing what are the guidelines to acquire data and work with this data. We tried to get to consensus. And most of the time, this consensus became, yes, I also did this mistake and I learned that I shouldn't do this thing. And that's what we collected as guidelines today. And finally, we always adopted a community-driven, mainly schema-based, using the brain imaging data structure, open development approach to develop our toolboxes, our documentation, and share the data that we collect. Very quickly, our community has 4 components, four core components. One is the set of toolboxes that we are maintaining. The other one is the approachable documentation that we are compiling in this moment and will be released very soon. We base this documentation on community practices and consensus within the community. And finally, the last core component is the community of users, developers, and researchers that are interested in physiology that form the project itself. And one interesting case that I think and that I learned in these years is how these 4 components are not staying there alone, but are actually working together, informing each other and working with each other to make this project come alive. Very quickly, just to give you an idea on what we're working on. So let's say that you're working with physiological data like respiration or cardiac pulse. You acquire this data in your MRI setting. If you're interested in this, you might use an MRI machine or some other proprietary device. You will get this raw data in proprietary format. So the first thing that you might want to do is put it in a format that you want to use and you are able to use with other type of toolboxes, for instance, in Python or MATLAB or whatever. In that case, we have a toolbox that does the bitsification for you. It's called Phys2Bits. Then we have a toolbox that does the data preprocessing and peak detection in physiological data. Recently, we decided to add a quality assessment, quality control toolbox as well, in order to assess if the data is actually in a good quality and can be used for the scope that it was collected. And finally, we decided to concentrate on the denoising on neuroimaging data for the moment. And so we have a toolbox that organizes and creates the models for physiological denoising of MRI, functional MRI in particular. We tend to describe this process well by having a documentation that supports everything. And these are, by the way, the name of the the libraries. There's Physiopy, PhysioQC, Big Data, and Physionoise, and we have the documentation about it. At the moment, we're working on 4 main points. The first one is the documentation itself. The second is PhysioQC, the QA/QC toolbox. We are working with other developers that are not necessarily in the community. For instance, Lars Karsper from Physio, you might have heard of him in these couple of days, to get together a testing data set for all physiological and neuroimaging toolboxes around there interested in standardizing the outcome of their code, independently of what the code is. And finally, in 2024, we're going to start working on a bit extension proposal specifically for the type of data that we are working on and working with, because we know that the BITS proposal in this moment is not completely covering this type of data. Now, a couple of information about Physiopy more. All volunteers are volunteers so far. There's nobody that is really working for Physiopy, and most of us are working around the topic, but are not necessarily working on these toolboxes as a project for their main line of research. The project was virtually no funded until now. Most of the funds were coming from my pockets. But that's hopefully going to change very soon. We're applying to many grants in this moment to find some more fundings and some more possibilities to bring on people. We were founded in 2019 by 9 people, and we were spanning 3 labs. And I'm happy to say that 4 years later, we are counting over 30 contributors in more than 24 institutions, and I think something like 12 countries in the world. And we're trying to be stable and move on and grow older and learning from each other. So very quickly, I want to give a couple of feedbacks on what I learned in this process. The first thing that I told you is I learned something that I wanted to learn since I was 8, which was becoming a juggler. Once you start working with a community of only volunteers that do not do this for their job, and there's no money involved, and it's just a lot of work, you know that there's a line, and you try to follow the line of development, and you try to steer the contributors toward that line, but most of the time you end up following them, and the line gets a bit more less straight, let's say, but it grows in interesting ways. And for instance, we never thought about having a very detailed documentation on the know-how of these data that we are working with, but we ended up in a certain point with no volunteer that was able to code, and so we said, okay, well, that's what we can do, let's do it, and it surely enriched our community. And that means also being ready to switch focus of the community when needed. As I just said, in one day you might work on code, the other day you might work on documentation, just because that's the type of volunteers that you have, and you want to work with them and you want to get the best that they can offer. The other thing that I learned is keeping everything in control and keep everything documented and well based. And that's the case for virtual control systems, version control systems. I'm sure you heard about them. There was something about it a couple of days ago. And if you missed it, it's an Ecoronella, and just check it out. And why is it important to use version control system when you start working in this type of projects? Because you have the history of what happens to the files, and that's very important, so you can see the changes. They're not messy, and they're fantastic, and it just tells you what's happening there. But especially you can attribute the work to your volunteers. And that's not just to attribute works and recognize the work that they're doing, but also because if somebody else comes in, you know who worked on what, and you know who to refer to if there is any question. I want to give you also a couple of ideas of what it means to work in communities versus working alone. So first of all, as I told you before, if you work alone, the development might be a straighter line. It might be more direct, while it might take a bit more of its own path if you work with other people. And that might take more time, at least at the beginning, and at least in the short run. So if you have a very quick deadline, maybe it's not the best. But it changes over time, and that's because you start having higher engagement, because there's more people working with you, more ideas shared, and sometimes ideas that you would never have thought by yourself. You get to get more mentors. So if there's changes or if there's a new person coming in the project, you get knowledge from multiple people. You don't have to be there yourself to teach. You also start with a bigger user base because, well, there is already at least more than one person to use the deliverables that you're doing and to consume them. And that means also that those deliverables are better tested over time because you get more feedbacks. And finally, if you do start with the community, you start from consensus, which is very different from what we do in our day-to-day job, where we finish a project and then we send it somewhere to some people to get the consensus about what you just did. It's a very different type of process, and sometimes it's just better to start with that. One thing that I found very complicated and I still did not solve was attribution of work. It's very clear how to attribute work, especially in code. If you're using version control systems, it becomes a bit more difficult when you're thinking about everything else that happens around it. So for instance, the organization of the meetings, the organization of events, talking, making outcome project and everything else. And so attribution becomes fuzzier, and that becomes a big problem in authorship, for instance. Many different communities use different strategies for authorships. And what I can say is we discussed about it in our community, and I invite you, if you're in a community, to discuss about it as well, if you don't have a clear guideline on that. And I want to say it's not just that you can be in a community or work alone. This is like working on these projects is a big spectrum of cases, and maybe there's a case up there that works better for you, and you can find it and just think if it works for you. So I want you to take home one message, that is, there are advantages and disadvantages in working within a community. Choose what better fit your aims and interests, and choose what better fit the aims and interest of your project. If I have a little bit of time, I just want to talk about a couple of do's. First of all, if you're in a community, learn from each other. Discuss good practices. If you don't have good practices or best practices, just try to learn as much as you can from your volunteers, because that's what I did. And for sure, that was the main, the big comeback for me and the big gain for me from this community project. And especially automate everything that you can. This is all the automation that we use in our community. It's a lot of work to take care of packages. It's a lot of work to take care of documentation. Everything that you can do to make that work easier and faster has to be done. I'm just leaving the list here. This is all the things that I learned how to work with, but basically from the moment we commit something in our version control systems, we standardize our code, we get a new DOI that makes us traceable, we get a new version release without me having to move a finger. And that's pretty fantastic because it saves a lot of time on the long run. So second take-home message, engage your community to learn more and better, and especially learn how to automate your work. I have so much more to tell you, but the time is almost over. So thank you very much for having me here. First of all, I want to thank the Physiopy contributors for all of the work that they did and all that they taught me. This is a bunch of amazing people that I love to collaborate with every day, and that's one of the reasons I stayed in academia so far, and I will stay in academia a bit longer if I manage to. If you're interested in joining our communities, we normally work with physiological data such as cardiac pulse, respiration gases, skin conductance, all of those physiological processes that are not necessarily EEG or MEG. And if you want to join us, we have a meeting every third Thursday of the month at 4 p.m. UTC. You can find at the bottom of the screen my contacts and the contact of the community. We have a website, we have an email. Please feel free to reach out to us. Thanks to the organizers for having me here, and thank you for listening so far. And if there's any question, I'm happy to take them.